Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Chronicles of Christendom. So we're continuing where we left off last time with the Mabinogi, that Welsh narrative that we've been covering. So in the last episode, we went through the first branch. So again, if you remember, there's like these four branches, as they're called, these four sections really. We went through the first one last time, and now we'll be going through the second one. And you need to really listen to the first one if you haven't already, because some things that happen in the first branch are going to become relevant in this second branch. And also in the first branch, we were mostly in southwest Wales with a little bit in southeast Wales, but very southern Wales. But now we're going to northwest Wales. And the story begins talking about Bendigeidfran, which means Bron, which is like a Welsh name. It means Bron the Blessed. So we have Bron the Blessed crowned king of the entire island of Britain with the crown of London. So already we have a couple of questions we have to answer, like what does it mean to be High King of Britain? And what does it mean to have the crown of the King of London? Because London wasn't anything. There was barely any settlements there until the Romans, after their invasion, settled a city there. And it seems like the narrative is paralleling Bron's crowning or coronation with William the Conqueror's coronation, because William the Conqueror was also coronated King of the Isle of Britain in London as well. And this High King position seems to be also more nominal in most places. We might even say like ceremonial, like maybe he's like in some sense he's the figure that binds together all of Britain, or he's seen as that binding figure, but he doesn't actually have the power that a king normally would have, or a lord normally would have over all of Britain. Rather, he just has his kingdom in northwest Wales, but he's also seen as the figurehead for this larger area, even though he doesn't have direct control over all of that area. That seems to be like what's going on here. We're also introduced at the start to some of his family members. So he has a brother, Manawydan, and he has two maternal half-brothers, so meaning they have the same mom. So that's going to be a Nisan and Efnisan. Nisan is said to be a great peacemaker, and he can even create peace between peoples, whereas Efnisan is said to cause hostility between brothers, even when they're very amicable to each other. So we see that their names are very similar, but they have very opposite personality traits. It's almost like they're twins, and Efnisan is like the evil twin. So one day, while the High King Bron is on a high place overlooking the sea in Harlech, which would be in like northwest Wales, on the coast, he sees 13 ships heading towards his coast, and then he sends men to go and meet them. Maybe it's an invasion, but he wants to see what's going on here. They see the sails of the ships are made of brocaded silk, which, if you remember, signifies the other world from our last episode. And then they also see that the ships are making like a sign of peace, indicating that they're not here to attack. And on the ships is the King of Ireland, King Matholwch. And he comes asking for Bron's sister, Bronwyn, to marriage. So after Bron hosts his guests, he takes counsel. And here counsel is going to become very important, because people are always taking counsel. All the rulers are taking counsel constantly before any decision. We saw a little bit of that in the first branch. I don't know if I touched too much on it though, but it is a little bit there in the first branch. But in this second branch, this idea of rulers taking counsel is very important. And it makes me think, and other people have thought this as well, that one of the ways to read these texts is almost as like a mirror of princes, which means that the text is a sort of didactic text that up-and-coming princes or rulers are supposed to read to know how to be better rulers. Like in the first branch, what we saw with Puil is that he constantly makes mistakes as a ruler, but then he rectifies them. And a lot of the mistakes that he makes aren't necessarily like, technocratic mistakes, but rather it's having an improper relationship with the other world. So you can see this as a mirror of princes telling up-and-coming princes and rulers that they need to have the proper relationship with the other world in order to ensure a good rule. But anyways, after Bronn takes counsel, he agrees, and then he marries off his sister in order to create an alliance with Ireland and the Island of the Mighty, as Britain is often called in this story. Now, at the wedding, we learn a key detail. We learn that the wedding did not take place in a house because no house has ever been big enough to contain Bronn. And we'll see this later, but Bronn is like this giant. Like, he's a massive person. It doesn't come into play, or it doesn't even really come up in like his day-to-day interactions with people or his interactions with people that we see. But there's going to be some crucial times throughout this narrative where his giant stature plays a key role. But I need to say this. Some people, including the person who I'm using the translation from, Will Parker, in his footnotes, he makes this argument that Bronn isn't actually like a physical giant. Rather, it implies, or it refers to his house just being so big. His house being like, his family, or, his rule, or, something like that. It's more a metaphorically big. But that, what we're going to see, that doesn't really make sense for quite a few reasons we'll see later on. And then that's not how anybody has ever interpreted this text, frankly. Like the figure of Bronn, he shows up elsewhere in like Celtic and even in some French stuff as well, like Arthurian stuff too, sort of. And the aspect of his largesse isn't always mentioned, but it sometimes is, and never are we really told anything about him having just such a large family or clan, is the sense in which he is a quote-unquote giant. No, that never happens. No one interprets it that way until the 21st century, frankly. So as part of the wedding, Bronn gives Matholwch several horses as a sort of wedding gift. But Efnisen, remember the brother who likes to cause controversy or infighting in between brothers, he takes the horses meant for Matholwch and then he mutilates them. And he does this, we're told, because he feels wronged that they married off his sister without his permission or without his consent. So Matholwch is very confused by this, that these horses are all mutilated, because he sees it as an insult, and he realizes that it is an insult. But he's like, just a little while ago, we were all feasting and everyone was happy. Like, what's going on here? So eventually, this gets figured out, and then Bronn, in order to further compensate him and make sure that he's totally satiated and that no blood feud is going to come about because of this, as I said earlier in the first branch, this idea of blood feuds plays a large role in the backdrop, at least, to the story. Like, people, whenever someone wrongs another person, they want to make sure that it's resolved quickly, and in a way that won't cause like a sort of blood feud where one person wrongs another person and then there's another wrong done and then another wrong done back, and so on and so forth. So Bronn gives Matholwch, he gives him more horses, and then he also gives him a magic cauldron. And the magic of the cauldron is that it can resurrect anybody who is put into the cauldron, but when they come back, they're going to be unable to speak. And I think the idea is that although there's a somewhat of a bodily, physical resurrection of sorts, there's no spirit in them, because they're not able to breathe, they're not able to speak. Right, so I think that speaking is related to breathing and like breath, spirit, kind of in the same way the Bible deals with those interrelated concepts. So Matholwch asks Bronn where he got the cauldron from, and then he reveals to him that he got this magical cauldron from Ireland. Some people from Ireland came over and gave it to him. And then Matholwch realizes what this cauldron is. He's seen it before, and then he explains to Bronn where it comes about. So he relates the story about how when he was in Ireland, he was near what was called the Lake of Cauldron. And it's not too clear if it's called the Lake of Cauldron because of the story or if it was known by that name previously. But anyways, he's by this lake, and Matholwch sees two huge people emerge from the lake with a cauldron. And he eventually starts hosting them in his court, but hosting them in his court causes all sorts of trouble. And he eventually concocts this plan to kill these people, but they're able to escape, and then they go across the sea over to the island of the mighty. And then Bronn realizes, those people. He says, oh yes, I know those people. Those people were hosted in my court, but I didn't have any problem with them. In fact, he says, and here quoting from the story, they were quartered in every corner of this kingdom and became numerous, raising up every area and strengthening every place that they happened to be, with men and arms that were the best that had ever been seen. And then the conversation cuts off and we go to the next scene. The point that the narrative is trying to tell us, though, is that, these people from the other world, right? This is classic otherworld figures, people coming out of a lake who are like these giants with this magical object. But when they're hosted in Matholwch's court, he's unable to integrate that otherworldly element into his rule, into his kingdom. But when Bronn hosts them, he hosts these otherworldly figures. He's not only able to integrate them into his kingdom, but he's able to use them to strengthen his kingdom. So we have a contrast between the two types of rulers of Bronn and Matholwch. So after this reconciliation, Matholwch and Bronwyn, they go to Ireland and they have a boy, Gurn. And we're told that they have a good first year. But in the second year, there's some murmuring amongst his court about the insult that he suffered in Wales. Even though there was a reconciliation and the wrong was righted, there's still this murmuring of what happened in Wales. And people begin to mock the king openly, and Matholwch feels compelled to take revenge. So here we see again Matholwch is kind of failing as a leader because he's taken this bad counsel. So in response to all this murmuring, he puts Bronwyn in the court bakery, and then every day the butcher comes and punches her in the ears. He also places a total embargo on Wales, and all the Welsh who are on Ireland or who get to Ireland, they are to be imprisoned. And this is so that no news or no word can travel between Wales and Ireland. And this scene parallels what we saw in the first branch with Rhiannon and Pwyll, where Rhiannon was unjustly punished for something she didn't do. So while Branwen is in the kitchens forced to bake, she teaches a bird how to speak, and then she tells it how to recognize her brother, so her brother King Bronn. And then she ties a note to the bird explaining everything that has happened, and then sends it off. And when Bronn gets the message, he hears about what's being done to Rhiannon and the embargo. He gets quite angry, and then he musters a large army to go over to Ireland. And then while his men get into boats to cross the sea, and we're actually told that the sea between Ireland and Wales wasn't that big as it was today. It was much smaller. So while his men get on boats, Bronn, actually just, we're told, wades through the water. So this is another idea of him being an actual giant, as well as he has all these minstrels with instruments on his back. And again, you can't wade through water with minstrels on your back if you're just figuratively large. And then the idea of the water being shallow also, I think, points to this kind of being like an antediluvian Ireland or an antediluvian kind of British Isles where the water wasn't so high. And as they're making their way to the coast, some swineherds, so people taking care of pigs, and these swineherds are kind of going to be relevant later, not in this branch, but in the later branches, and we'll talk a little bit more about pigs there when they show up. So anyways, they see the people from the Island of the Mighty, as Britain is called, coming, and they go and tell Matholwch. But their description is quite strange of what they see, so I'll read it here. "Lord," said they, the swineherds, "we have seen some strange tidings. We have seen a forest on the ocean, where we had never before seen a single tree." "That is a peculiar thing," said he, so said Matholwch. "Could you see anything other than that?" "Lord," they replied, "a great mountain beside the forest, and that was moving, and a soaring ridge on the mountain, and a lake on each side of the ridge, and the forest, and the mountain, and all of that was moving." "Well," said Matholwch, "there is no one here who's going to know anything about this. If Bronwyn doesn't know, ask her." And then they send messengers to Bronwyn. So the idea here, I think, is that Matholwch doesn't really have that good of counsel, and that he has to go to his wife, even though, he has her in this imprisonment. So they send messengers to Bronwyn, and they say, "Lady," said they, "what do you suppose this is?" "Although a lady I am not," she answered, referring to her current state in this punishment, "I know what this is. The men of the island of the mighty are coming over, having heard about my punishment and my dishonor." "What is the forest that was seen on the ocean?" they asked. "The alder mast of the ship and the sail trees," said she. "And what is the mountain that was seen alongside the ships?" "That was Bron, my brother," said she, "coming by wading. There is no boat that can contain him inside." "What is the soaring ridge and the lake on either side of the ridge?" "He," she said, "is looking at the island and is angry. His 2 eyes on either side of his nose are the 2 lakes on either side of the ridge." So again, we see the largesse of Bron, that he looks like a moving mountain, and the ships look like trees that are moving. And this is something, this is a theme that I talked about in the beginning of the last episode, which is that the main character of these narratives is like the land of Wales itself, like the actual landscape. And we see here that it's as if the landscape of Wales is going to Ireland. So like the Welsh soldiers and Bron are like the various elements in the landscape. Like that's how they're seen as. So Matholwch then musters his men, and then they cross the Shannon River. So the Shannon River, or is actually called by its Welsh name here. But anyways, they cross the Shannon River. They go to the other side. And this river, more or less, even today, it kind of like splits Ireland in half from west to east. And then they destroy all of the bridges. That way that no one can cross over. And as well as because there's a bunch of stones on the bottom of the river, boats can't travel across it either. And then Bron's men tell him what has happened, and then he says, "Whoever would be head, let him be the bridge. I myself will be the bridge." And then Bron gets into the river and then acts as a physical bridge so that his men can cross it. And before any fighting can begin, Matholwch sends messengers saying, basically asking for a peace, saying, "Look, we'll make Gurn, the son, we'll make him the king of Ireland, and whatever else you want, we'll give it to you." They then sweeten the deal, and they'll say they'll even build a house for Bron that contain him, even though no house has ever contained him in the past. They agree to these terms, and then, peace is made, and they build this large house. But the Irish lay a trap in the house. So in the house, they set up these crane skin bags throughout the place, and they put men inside the bags, or one man inside each of the bags. And then they're going to hold the ceremony to make Gurn the sovereign of Ireland. But before Bron and his men get to the house for the ceremony, Efnisien, remember, he's the brother that is the one who's kind of like the troublemaker. He was described at the very beginning of causing animosity between brothers. So he's at the house, and then some of the Irish are there, and then he points out the bags, and he says, "What's in this bag?" And then each time the Irish say flour, and then Efnisien grabs the bag and then just squeezes it until he crushes the skull of each of the soldiers. So there's no more soldiers in the bag. They're all dead, squeezed to death. Now, this may seem like a good thing, but we'll see here in a minute how this causes quite a bit of trouble. So Bron and his men eventually, come to the house, and they have the ceremony, and then Gurn is made the king of Ireland. But then Efnisien, he takes Gurn, and then he throws him into a fire. And he says something interesting before he does it. He says, "To God I make my confession. It is an unspeakable crime against the kindred what I'm about to do this very hour." So after he's thrown into the fire, this huge brawl breaks out in the house. And then as this brawl is going out, this huge fight, the Irish, they light the cauldron of rebirth, and then they start throwing the dead bodies into the cauldron, with the idea being that they'll rise again the next day, and they'll be able to fight again, even though they won't be able to speak. So the fact that they had the cauldron there, and the fact that they so readily lit it, I think that implies that the men were expecting some sort of fight to go down. And this would make sense because earlier they had laid the trap with the crane bags, with the men in the bags. But Efnisien spoils this, and he causes as much carnage as possible by removing the Irish reinforcements, and he makes it so that almost everyone dies in this fight. There's no decisive victory. Efnisen even breaks the cauldron of rebirth, but when he does this, we're told that his heart breaks as well and that he dies. Only 8 people altogether on the Welsh side survive, and all of the Irish are dealt with. But King Bronn, he's one of the survivors. However, he's stabbed in the foot with a poisoned spear. And I think what the implication is here, based off how later stories kind of take this figure of Bronn, who later becomes like the Fisher King in later Arthurian stories, I think that being stabbed in the foot with a spear, a poisoned spear, is a euphemism for castration. And some of the survivors we learn are Manawython, who is the brother of King Bronn, as well as Pryderi, who at the end of the first branch is the king of Dafed. He's the son of Pwyll and Rhiannon. And the wounded Bronn orders the survivors to cut off his head. And then he says, "Take the head and bring it to the White Hill in London, and bury it with its face towards France. And you will be on the road a long time. In Harlech you will see 7 years in feasting. The birds of Rhiannon singing to you. The head will be as a good company to you as it was as its best when it was ever on me. And you will be at Gwales and Penfro for 80 years, until you open the door facing Aberhenvelen on the side facing Cornwall. You will be able to abide there, along with the head with you uncorrupted. But when you open that door, you will not be able to remain there. You will make for London and bury the head. Cross over to the other side." So we have this giant of Bronn, but he has his head cut off, but he's still alive. If you look into the way that giants are treated throughout literature, like ancient and medieval literature, the idea of a giant is like somebody with too much body, someone who's too material, and that's normally the problem with giants, right? However, with Bronn, they cut off his head, so they sever his head from his body. However, he's still able to be alive. He still talks, and they sort of treat him as if, everything was normal. So even though Bronn is a giant, he's one of these, antediluvian giants. He is one of the good ones because he doesn't suffer from this problem of too much body. In fact, they can cut off his body from his head, and he can still function essentially as normal. And we saw a little foreshadowing earlier when Bronn, right before he was about to use his body to help cross the river, he says, "Whoever would be head as in like a leader, let him be the bridge." But now we see that phrase is taken quite literally, and he is now just a head. I also want to focus on the liminal aspect of Bronn. So as I just mentioned, if you remember, he becomes a bridge. So a bridge is something that unites 2 sides or 2 worlds together. But also we can see him in a much more larger sense to be a bridge between the old world and the new Christian world. So the place where we first meet Bronn is his coronation in London, where he becomes the High King. And London, as I said, was interesting that they mention it because London was founded by the Romans after their invasion. And the Romans, because they bring Roman culture and, the Roman milieu to the British Isles, they also bring Christianity alongside the British Isles because certain Roman Christians were in Britain, and that's where the first Christians in Britain were. So by being anachronistic and linking Bronn with London, they're also linking Bronn with Christianity as well. So going back to our story, there's sort of like 9 survivors. There's the 7 that we mentioned, which includes Pryderi and Manawython, as well as some others. And then there's also Bronwyn, and then there is Bronn and his talking head. But as they make their way back to Wales and finally step foot on Welsh land, they look back towards Ireland, and then Bronwyn dies in despair. She says, "Alas, son of God," she exclaimed, "woe to me that I was ever born. 2 good islands have been ruined because of me." She gives a great sigh, and with that breaks her heart. A 4-sided grave was made for her. So she dies similar to Efnisen, in the way that Efnisen dies because of a break of his heart. Bronwyn also dies because of a break of her heart as well. So then the 7 plus the head make their way back to Harlech, where the story began, the place in northwest Wales. And they learn from people there that Caswallon, the son of Beli, has taken over the Island of the Mighty and is now crowned king of London. And he is also slain with an invisibility cloak all the people who were left in charge of Wales while Bronn was out fighting in Ireland. And the way that the story words this, it makes it quite clear that this was a usurpation. This wasn't, line of succession. This was just, taking power. And this notion is also supported historically if we look at what this name Caswallon refers to. And it refers to this figure who led the British resistance, so like the native British pre-Roman resistance against the Roman invasion, specifically against Julius Caesar. So what historians would know this man as would be a Cassivellaunus, if I'm pronouncing that right. And he does not necessarily have the greatest reputation, especially in the Christian Celtic world at this time, because his resistance to the Romans was considered a resistance to Christianity. This also helps to, in some sense, like symbolically locate the story in time, not necessarily in like a linear, historical fashion, but rather in terms of meaning. It helps us situate the story to take place right before the introduction of Christianity into, Celtic lands. But as we'll see, time does not flow linearly in this story. Time works in very weird ways. We saw a little bit of this with Rhiannon, and when we first met her when she was on horseback, where even though the people chasing after her, they would go faster and faster and faster, her horse was still at the same pace, but seemed to go further and further away from them. And then another example is what happens next in the story. So the survivors, the 7 plus Bronn, they have a feast at Harlech for 7 years. And it's not to say that they were just relaxing for 7 years in leisure. Rather, it quite literally is saying that they had the same feast at the same table with the same food, basically, for 7 years straight. And then while they're doing this, they also hear the birds of Rhiannon. So it's these birds that are out in the ocean, and even though they're kind of far away from them, they can hear them as if they're so close to them. So again, we see this weird way in which space and time is moving. So after their 7 years of feasting, they go to Gwales, and they see this great hall, which they call a beautiful kingly place, above the ocean. So it's like floating in the sky. And we're not really told how they get in there, but they somehow get in there, and they see in the hall that there's 3 doors. 2 of them are open, but 1 that is closed. And then Monowethon says that is the door that they must never open. And he says this because earlier Bronn, after he had his head chopped off, he said that they will be in a hall in Gwales and that there will be a door which they are not supposed to open. And that night, the story says, they were there, lacking nothing, and were completely free of care. Of all the grief that they had ever witnessed or experienced themselves, there was no longer any memory, or any sorrow in the world. 80 years they passed there, having never enjoyed a period of time as carefree or light-hearted as that. It was no more irksome to them. They didn't realize from their companions how long it had been since they came there. And it was no more irksome for them having the head there than it had been when Bronn had been alive with them. And because of that, it was known as the Assembly of the Wondrous Head. So again, we see time not working so linearly here, especially since they're probably in the other world. 80 years go by, but none of them get old and die. No one really notices anything. They just kind of go on business as usual, having a good time. And then after 80 years, one of them finally opens the door that they were not supposed to open. And when he looked, it says, suddenly everything they had ever lost, loved ones and companions, and all the bad things that had ever happened to them, and most of all, the loss of their king, became as clear as if it had been rushing in towards them. And from that moment, they were not able to rest unless they were making for London with the head. However long they were on the road, they came to London and they buried the head in the White Hill. And then we're told that as long as the head was buried, no affliction would ever come to the island from across the sea. So we can see the head as some sort of relic that protects the land. And then this is almost the end. So, this is the end in terms of the Island of the Mighty. However, we do get a little bit more about Ireland before the end of the tale. So we learn that in Ireland that no person was left alive except for 5 pregnant women. And then after these 5 women give birth, their children then go on to procreate with the other women. So there's no incest involved, However, it still suggested that this way of procreation is somehow still like wrong because of the like age gap, I guess. And then from these 5 women and these 5 descendants, we then get the 5 parts of Ireland. So Ireland was traditionally divided into like these 5 provinces or 5 kingdoms or segments, whatever you want to call it. And even today, although the provinces have shifted around and come and gone, but even today, the word in Irish for province still means 5th. Anyways, that's all for today. I'll be publishing the 3rd branch next week, so I hope you stay tuned for that. Thank you so much.